we're going to be in Hebrews today. Hebrews 11, actually. And this week this is something I studied a while back, and I was looking at a couple of different things, and I was back in the Old Testament for a while, and I don't know, this we're going to be talking about the faith of Abraham, of all things today. So it goes right along with what we're talking about here. I want to look at two main points, Abraham's faith in stepping into the unknown and his heavenly motivation for his life of obedience. And as this church, and I was thinking about the church right now as we're going through these changes and transitions, and the faith that we need to continue on. And so the way I like to do these things, as you guys know, is I like to kind of give us some background, and then I'll bring it around to some points that we can take and apply to our lives. So now, if you guys weren't aware, I'm going to give you some revelation. Abraham's a pretty important guy. All right, if y'all haven't figured that out, he's pretty important. And he's not just important to us, he's also important he's important to the Jewish faith, the nation, but he's important to Christians. Romans 4:11-6 talks about that, or 11 through 16 says this. He's the father of all those that believed. He's mentioned 70 times in the New Testament, including the very first verse in Matthew 1, where it states that Jesus was a descendant of both David and Abraham. Now, here's something you may not know. He's very important to Islam, where he is seen as the prophet and father of the Arab nations. So Abraham has a pretty prominent role in a lot of religions today through Ishmael, which is a descendant. So, the Arab nations consider him a prophet. There are three main faiths, all have an association with him. But most importantly, he was a man of great faith who pleased God. So we're going to look at him a little bit. For the first 99 years of his life, and I'm going to give a little background, and then we'll kind of go into this a little bit more. But for the first 99 years of his life, Abraham, father of a multitude, that's what it means, was called Abram, which means exalted father. For the first 75 years, he lived with his brethren in his native country of Chaldea in the city of Ur. Now, this was the southernmost part, and I'm looking at getting us a map. Okay, I'm going to get two maps in here, a current map, and then I want one of biblical times, so that we can, when we start calling out these, and you start mentioning Ur and Mesopotamia and things like that, we'll actually have some references to look at. But anyway, it was in the southern part of Mesopotamia, or what is today known as southern Iraq. It is estimated his journey would have been between 800 and 1,000 miles on foot. Could you imagine setting out on foot for 800 to 1,000 miles and not even really knowing where you were going? You just had God said, hey, go, and you were like, yeah, okay. I'll take everything I've got. I'm going to trust you, God, and I'm going to go. And then you walk 1,000 miles. I'm not sure very many of us would make that journey, even in a car today. But this is him. Most inhabitants of Ur worshipped a moon god. I don't know if you knew that. It's an interesting little tidbit. There's a gentleman who writes, Ray Stedman writes, it was once thought that Ur was a very primitive city, but the spade of archaeology, I didn't write this, but very creative, but the spade of archaeology has since turned up the ruins of Ur. They've actually found the city of Ur. And we learned that this was a great city of wealth, considerable culture, containing a library and a university. Very unusual for the times it was in. The city was devoted to the worship of the moon goddess. And it's almost certain that Abram was an idolater, that he worshipped the moon goddess just like everybody else did. In the book of Joshua, Joshua addresses the tribes of Israel, mentions this at the start of his address by saying, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel says, long ago your forefathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the river and worshipped other gods. So even the Bible says this. So So that's the family that Abraham grew up with. They were all adulterers, but God in his sovereignty, he saw Abraham and he chose him. And God knows the heart, just like we were talking about earlier. God knows the heart of man. He knows where we are, and he knew the heart of Abraham. And it's just like when you think of him saying to the disciples, how many disciples do you read about said, no, I'm not going to follow you? When he called to them and said, come and follow me, they followed him, didn't they? He knew their heart. Now, it would have been an interesting read if he had said, hey, come and follow me. And they went, yeah, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. I mean, we don't see that in the scriptures, do we? It's because God knows the heart just like he knew the heart of Abraham. Now, to take him out of his family and his land with all its wealth and all its false gods, to make him an entirely new nation that would be separated to the Lord, that's pretty good when you know, well, God knew that that's what was going on. Whoa. All right. So, Hebrews 11:8, let's see where it is. And it says, and by faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he went out, not knowing whither he went. Okay. So, by faith Abram, when he's called, obeyed by going out in a place which he was to receive as an inheritance. Okay, so God calls him and says, hey, I want you to go here. I got a place I'm going to give you. And Abram just went. I read this a few times and I thought, man, I've heard this all my life. But to think about how comfortable are you in your life? How comfortable are you in your home, in your church at times, in your faith? And yet God say, okay, I need you to go do this. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. But some of you going out, I've gone out to my car and got in and went, where was I going? I can't even remember where I was going today. And yet Abraham just went. He didn't need to know where he was going. He trusted God and just went by faith. We talk about people in our lives who are struggling with faith right now. And this is the kind of faith we all need, is when God leads us, we need to follow. And it's hard at times. He simply left. He didn't have GPS or Google Maps. He just started going, and God said that direction, and Abraham took off. There was no reservation where he was going. He just went out knowing that where he was going, or not knowing where he was going, but while realizing he would never return. And that's another thing I think is hard for us at times, is sometimes our faith requires us to know that we're never going back to where we were before. And I mean that in our spiritual faith. When God calls us into teaching, you can't go back. I mean, I don't know, when you've preached a couple of times, it's hard to say, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to teach anymore. Because when God's called you into this, singing or just a ministry, when He calls you into something, it's very difficult to just say, no, I don't want to do this anymore. Because when you're called into it, it's life-changing. It's almost impossible to go back. So let's look at the call of Abram in Genesis 12, 1 through 9. The Lord has said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. 3 says, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. So Abram left, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, and all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Morah at Shechem. And I would love to have seen this, simply because it sounds like that would be pretty cool. If they call it out in the Bible, a great tree of Morah at Shechem, that would probably be impressive to see. At the time the Canaanites were in the land, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. This is the first of 7 recorded times that Abraham received direct instructions and revelation from God. This passage records the first description of what is called the Abrahamic covenant. And it involves a specific command from God for Abraham to go forth. If Abraham would do this, God would do the following. So here's the things that God said. If you do this, Abram, if you leave your family, if you leave all that you know, if you just trust me and do what I tell you to do, here's what's going to happen. He says, I'm going to make you a great nation. Genesis 10. 70 nations are listed coming forth from Noah's 3 sons. But now God will make one more of his own from Abraham, one that will be separated from the others throughout history. And we know that this is true. Look at Christianity. Look at the Jewish nation. Look at Islam, for that matter. All these are descendants, direct descendants from Abraham. I will bless you, a personal blessing, both material and spiritual, upon Abram himself. I will make your name great, personal honor for this man Abram. When we're here, we are 4,000 years later, and we're still talking about it. We have this great book that tells us about it. That's pretty much making his name great, don't you think? I will bless those who bless you and curse those that curse you. This was a personal promise for Abraham himself, but later the same promise is spoken of all of Israel. God is still honoring this promise, which even empires throughout history have discovered when they turn out against Israel and Jews. How many times have y'all ever seen the size of Israel as far as a country goes in Europe? I know you've been there, but when you look on a map at the nation of Israel, I think, isn't it the size of New Jersey?
Yeah, it's tiny.
Size of about New Jersey. Now that's a country. How hard would it be to overrun that country?
And it's surrounded by enemies.
But surrounded by enemies on every side. And yet they have stood the test of time. And any nation that has gone against them has miserably failed. Even huge countries, huge nations that have tried to attack them throughout the years have failed miserably. Why? Right here's why.
That's right.
You can talk about their military. I'm sorry, we have more people in one state than they do in their entire country.
Yeah.
So our military might has to be 10 times greater, but if we went up against them, we would lose. It's just that simple. And it's because God says he will bless them.
That's right.
Man, I tell you what, that's amazing to me. The other thing he says, all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. This would, as Paul brings out in Galatians, find its fulfillment in the son of Abraham, who? Jesus Christ, the direct descendant. So the entire world is blessed because of Abraham's faith. And as a direct descendant of that, Jesus Christ gave the world a way out of sin. He gave the world a way out. So when it says that all the nations or all the people of the world would be blessed, it's because he sent his son. And they can all be blessed from this. How many Christian nations in the world are blessed? How many times do you hear, I wish it was so nowadays, we don't hear it as much. If you go back 50, 60 years ago, and companies, when they said that they had a Christian working for them, he was the most reliable, most dependable, the one they could count on. Not so much anymore. We kind of blend into the background. We should be that one that if you put on your resume Christian, every employer should go, oh, I want him. I want him because my company will be blessed because of him. You look at Joseph and Joseph's story and look at Egypt, but they were blessed because of God's chosen man. That's the way it's supposed to be with us. And unfortunately, not so much today, but it should be that way. Matter of fact, even my worldly boss has made the comment, I don't like hiring Christians because they're the worst. And unfortunately, that's what we've gotten to today. But it shouldn't be that way. Anyway, verse 4 tells us that Abraham left as God told him to. He left not only his country, not only his people, but also his extended family and stepped forth into the own, beginning a journey to the promised land. What a step of faith, but there is a very real sense in which this story is played out again in the life and call of every Christian. We have to do this daily, don't we? We have to step out in faith and trust Him. Just as Abraham left his life in Ur, when we became Christians, do you realize you literally had to make a choice to say, okay, I'm going to give up this life that I've been living. And some of us, I mean, if Michael were in here, I think he could say, look at the life I chose to live. Look at where I was. I had to choose this life, and when I did, I knew I had to give all that up. I had to make a decision to move past that. Now, I wasn't a bad kid growing up. I can remember my first cuss word. I'd call it out, but I'd probably get in trouble, so I won't do that. But I can remember my first. I was in college when I said my first cuss word. Drinking was never a thing. My dad was an interesting father. When I was 3 or 4 years old, he would take 2 or 3 sips of his beer and then just hand it to me. So I'm sitting on the porch swing at 3 or 4 years old drinking a beer with my dad. And he didn't think anything about it. He thought it was cute. I grew up not caring about alcohol because of that. I had it, so I didn't need that anymore. Everybody else was talking about going and getting a beer. Well, I was like, that stuff tastes terrible. I don't want that. Yeah. So for me, it was no big deal. But growing up, I made good grades. I wasn't a bad kid. But guess what? I was bound for hell, just like everybody else, until I come into the saving grace of Christ. And I knew it would still change my life. Now, those who have had to make a big change, like Abraham, leaving everything behind, that's a big change for them. But you still know, I knew that there were friends of mine who probably wouldn't hang out with me anymore. Friends of mine who would, you know what, because I started going to every revival they had in Chattanooga. Me and a buddy of mine, we would go to tent revivals, to church functions. Back in those days, we get arrested nowadays, we used to go kidnap people and drag them to church revivals or tent meetings. We'd go and call our buddy and say, hey, we're going out. You want to go with us? Sure. And we'd go and then we'd snatch them and we'd take them to these things. Well, that's what we were doing, and we knew that we lost friends doing that. So you have to go into a new world, and that's what Abram did here when he followed Christ, or when he followed God. And I think it's the same for all of us. There are times when we had to leave something behind and it was hard for us. So let's look at Abram's motivation for his journey of faith. Hebrews 11, 9 and 10 says, by faith he sojourned in the land of promise as in a strange country, dwelling in the tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For you look for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. So Abraham made his way through the promised land, or way to the promised land, dwelling in tents and building altars to God in various places. In fact, those two outward symbols of Abraham's life, the tent and the altar, sum up his life as both a pilgrim on this earth and a worshiper of God along the way. But what was his motivation? You think, well, he was motivated going to find this land of promise that God had told him. It is the land that, or I guess the question is it the land that was incredibly important to the Jewish race then and now? And you'd think about it, that land, that strip of land that God promised them, they fight tooth and nail over it, won't they? That is what God gave them. That is their promised land. The Jewish people have a deep connection to the land of Israel that seems built into their DNA. That's why so many people feel this inward desire and urge to leave. You think when they were scattered out, and then when Israel became a nation again, what happened? Jews from all over the world left where they had grown up now, where they had their families and everything. They said, no, we're going home. And they all migrated back to Israel. Why? It's almost as if it's built into their DNA because God chose them and God said, I'm giving you this promised land. And even today, young Jews tend to want to find their way back to Israel because this is their promised land. And so they follow that. It just seems like they'll leave whatever country they're in at a certain age and they have to go there. And it's because God promised them this. He chose them, called them out, and He said, this is yours. This is yours for a promise. But according to the book of Hebrews, the father of the Jewish race didn't have his eyes on the promised land so much as the land still to come. Now think about this. He wasn't looking so much for a city of Jerusalem as he was for the heavenly city. That's what it says here. We see it, the Jewish people saw it as a physical place. And I think maybe that's why they missed Jesus when they did, was because they were looking at the promised land when even Abraham had his eyes on a heavenly city. Not so much on a particular plot of land as it was on a heavenly city that God had promised him. His motivation, his gaze was on the heavenly city whose architect and builder was God. I kind of like this thought. I wish we as Christians had that in our DNA like the Jewish people do about Israel. I wish we had in our DNA heaven built into us, that our desire and our goal and our thoughts are on that I need to achieve that I need to work for that I'm going to be diligent to get that. But I think a lot of times we just meander through and we don't have that strong urge like we should, that is our goal, that my brother-in-law, he's one of those that he works for rewards. Now you think, well, that sounds terrible. No, he works for heavenly rewards. He wants his position in heaven to be so that when he gets there, he can lay it down and say, God, look what this is for you. It's not like he's trying to do it for himself, but if we were working in a world where we knew at the end of our life we could cash out somehow and achieve something that would either be good for our family or good for us, we would do that, right? Well, the Bible teaches us that that's exactly what happens. In our faith and our work and our walk in this world, what we do for God, we're laying up heavenly treasures that one day we can lay at His feet. If everybody had that mentality to think, God, I can't wait to lay this room full of treasures down, not for me, not for my own gain, but to lay them down at the one who gave His life for me. Wouldn't that change how we do everything in this world? Wouldn't that motivate us differently? Wouldn't that, I would hope it would set the church on fire. And people going, oh my God, if I do this, I've got a crown I can lay at Jesus' feet for what He did for me. That should motivate each and every one of us. Doesn't as much as it should. Some of us only see the here and now and fight so hard for what they have, and it's all going to pass. But our eternal destination should be what's important. I read an Alabama tombstone inscription on an article, and I thought it was kind of neat. It said, "Here lies Solomon Pease, under the daisies and under the trees. But Pease is not here, only the pod. Pease shelled out and went home to God." We should all be ready to do this. We all should be ready to go home with Him. But even for Christians, it's easy to lose this eternal perspective when things of this earth cloud our view. When your wife's sick, when the bills need to be paid, when the job is pulling you 22 different directions, when you lose your job, it's really hard to focus on heaven when the world is throwing all its garbage on you at one time. And so we have to try to keep that eternal perspective even in the midst of all those trials. In the late 1980s, Dave Hunt wrote a book called Whatever Happened to Heaven. Today we could also ask whatever happened to hell, because we don't ever hear about preaching about hell. Hunt rightfully saw that the church had moved from its historical emphasis in the hope of heavenly home and eternal matters to come, and was becoming more and more focused on the here and now. In the language of more recent popular book, the church became focused on your best life now. And that's what our church has become. It's not focused on heaven. It's not focused on hell. I grew up in a Southern Baptist church where we heard about hell every Sunday. And you were going to hell every Sunday if you didn't get saved. You couldn't pry salvation out of my soul because I knew. And if I heard this once, I've heard this thousands of times in my life. You have to know that you know that you know Now that's a Southern Baptist preacher, hellfire and brimstone preacher. And Brother Les Chadwick, he could bring down the rain. And every Sunday we heard about salvation. So somebody was in the altar because they thought, man, I need to get saved. We don't hear that anymore.
No.
We hear encouragement. That's great. We hear about the love of God. That's great. We need to hear about hell.
Yep.
We need to hear that it's still hot. We need to hear that heaven is still real and that there are consequences to sin. We don't hear about sin being preached in the altars anymore. We have to hear these things. When you get to this, I need to work with what I have and preach to the level of people I have. When people don't hear about these things, we get a weak church. And when we get a weak church, we get exactly what we have in our society right now, and that is weak Christians that can't stand when the troubles of life come, that when this world throws everything at them, they falter. And why is that? Because they have no roots. And when you have roots in knowing that hell's real and it's hot and it's nipping at my buttocks every single time I turn around, you want to make sure that you're not there. And I think we've all missed that. Our kids don't hear that anymore. When's the last time, and I'm not knocking any pastor, it's not my goal, TV, radio, or in a church, when's the last time you heard somebody preach about hell? When's the last time you heard a preacher preach about sin? And I'm talking about really get in there, the nitty-gritties and the consequences of sin. We don't hear about it anymore. And we have to understand that. Soapbox, sorry. So what did Abraham know about the heavenly city to come? I find it amazing that Abraham was looking and keeping us focused on this eternal heavenly city. And what did he know? What had he seen? We really don't know. You can turn to the Old Testament and find God giving Abraham details about the heavenly city. But though it isn't recorded, Abraham clearly was given revelation about this topic. So nobody told him about the heavenly city. He just knew about it. So is there a possibility God spoke to him? Sure there is. We don't know the conversations. Abraham was one of those fortunate people that heard from God, and they may have had hundreds of conversations over the years. And I just love that idea. Now, we have the Holy Spirit speaking to us in still small voice now, but Abraham heard him, talked to him. Man, that's powerful. H.A. Ironside says the 10th verse of Hebrew 11 suggests that God had made wonderful revelations to Abraham, which are not recorded in the Old Testament. For we read, "He looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God." The city is never described for us until we come to the closing chapters of the book of Revelation. It is the home of all the saints of God, and toward that Abraham looked, and because of its glory, counted things then present as small, as of a small moment. Clearly, Abraham saw more than is revealed in the Old Testament. Again, sometimes we think of these things and we think, well, we don't have it in the Scriptures. Well, guess what? God didn't. The Bible even says that if even just the acts of Jesus, all the volumes of the books of the world couldn't contain what he did. There's things in here we don't know. And a lot of times we go, well, if it's not in here, by God, well, guess what? Right here we know that evidently Abraham got a glimpse of something that we don't get. Why are you grinning?
I thought you were funny.
Huh? Okay. But anyway, that's never a good thing when you look back and your wife's grinning at you. All right, so let's keep the right focus, and then hopefully, yeah. How close? Oh, no. We're not going to get there. All right. Let's look at let's just try to take some quick conclusions from this. I'm still missing a section, but we're going to do this anyway before the bell rings here in just a minute. So, the importance of obedience in his journey. God appeared to Abraham and said, go. Imagine if Abraham had said, I don't like it. I'm good right here. Got my family. We're blessed. Not going to go. Same thing goes for us. We need to learn and obey in our lives. Sometimes the journey may seem hard. Sometimes the journey may seem impossible. Sometimes the task, go talk to that person. Go pray for this person. hey, tell them about Jesus. And you're sitting there going, God, that's going to embarrass me. I'm doing this in a restaurant. I really can't do this. We need to put everything else in front and do exactly what God said. God doesn't reveal the whole journey to us, does He? How many times, and I can remember back in the day I was at a restaurant, and I used to carry a cross in my pocket. And I'm sorry, and I know this is recorded here, but I used to have to take people to lunch all the time. And as in my business, sometimes I would go to places that may or may not seem appropriate. But one of those days I was at Hooters. Okay, I'm sorry. But I was at Hooters. Took a group there, good food. I like the food. But anyway, as I was out with this group, I had that cross in my pocket. And this girl, she looked like she was just having the worst day of her life. And so as I got ready to leave, I just took that cross out and I handed it to her. And it said Jesus Saves on it. That's all it said. It had scripture on the back, little aluminum cross. I used to carry them around all the time. I got up, and as we got to leave, she grabs me at the door, and she's squalling. And she asked me, she said, can you pray for me? So we're sitting here praying in a Hooters with this girl about some of the things going on in her life. And so even though I felt like I was going to embarrass myself for doing this, I was embarrassed for being there, whatever the case was, followed God's leading. And I didn't understand why, but it made an impact. Sometimes it doesn't make sense. Sometimes we don't understand why. Sometimes it may be embarrassing. Sometimes it may be tough. But we still need to follow what God has in store for us. I'm not going to get anywhere near the finish. Even on my conclusion, I've still got 2 pages. So let's just, we'll stop there. Maybe try to pick this up again. But the main thing is, understand that when God calls us to do something, when He gives us direction in our life, He may not tell us where we're going. And that's going to put us in a very uncomfortable position. We like to know the entire plan. And guess what? God doesn't give us that. He just simply says, go. Do this. And though it may seem illogical, though it may seem impractical, though it may seem like it makes zero sense, sometimes just following God, it impacts us in ways we'll never know. I think Brother Tim was talking about it Wednesday night. When we get to heaven, somebody's going to come up and say, you don't remember this. But that Tuesday night at Walmart, when you dropped something on your toe and you went, well, Jesus saves, instead of going, oh, whatever. I saw that. And I thought, man, I need to have that in my life instead of what I've got. You'll never know the impact you have. And sometimes it just takes faith. So let's be dismissed and pray for the service. So.